The first shot shattered the restaurant's front window at exactly 9:37 on a Tuesday night, sending crystalline fragments across polished marble floors like deadly snow. Aria Thompson dropped behind the bar counter, her serving tray clattering to the ground as her military training kicked in with ruthless precision. 3 years of evening shifts at Hanbach had taught her to read the wealthy clientele, to anticipate their needs before they voiced them. But nothing had prepared her for the 5 men who stormed through the entrance with automatic weapons raised. The elegant Korean restaurant had been her sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could blend into the background while earning enough to cover her nursing school loans and her grandmother's medical bills. She knew every corner of the establishment, every exit, every blind spot the security cameras couldn't reach. Tonight, that knowledge might save her life. From behind the mahogany bar, she watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment her combat medic training had drilled into her. The attackers moved with professional efficiency, their faces hidden behind black masks, their weapons sweeping the dining room in practiced arcs. Patrons screamed and scattered, overturning chairs and abandoning half-eaten meals in their desperate flight toward any available exit. But one man remained seated at table 12, his back straight against the burgundy leather banquette, his hands folded calmly on the white tablecloth. Jin-Woo Park hadn't moved when the first shot rang out, hadn't flinched when chaos erupted around him. His dark eyes tracked the attackers with the cold assessment of a predator watching lesser threats enter his territory. Arya had served him dozens of times over the past 6 months, always noting his quiet authority, the way other diners instinctively lowered their voices when he entered, how the restaurant staff moved with extra precision when he was present. She'd assumed he was some kind of businessman, successful enough to afford the restaurant's premium prices 3 times a week, important enough that the manager always personally ensured his usual table remained available. Now she understood why his presence commanded such respect. This wasn't fear of a difficult customer. This was recognition of something far more dangerous. I wonder where you're watching this unfold from tonight. Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet town, you probably understand that moment when everything changes in an instant. When the ordinary world reveals the extraordinary lurking just beneath its surface. The lead attacker barked something in Russian, his weapon trained on Jin-Woo's motionless form. The Korean man responded in the same language, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made subordinates snap to attention. Whatever he said made the Russians grip tighten on his rifle, made his companions shift their positions to better surround their target. Aria's pulse thundered in her ears as she calculated distances and angles. The emergency exit behind the bar was 12 feet away. The kitchen doors offered another route, but that would mean crossing the open floor where the gunman could see her. Her breath came in shallow, measured intervals as she weighed her options, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Then Jin-Woo moved, and Arya understood why 5 armed men had been sent to kill him. He flowed from his seat like liquid mercury given human form, his expensive charcoal suit never restricting his movements as he closed the distance to the nearest attacker. The crystal water glass on his table became a weapon, its edge finding the vulnerable spot beneath the man's Kevlar vest with surgical precision. The Russian dropped his rifle as he fell, blood spreading across the pristine marble floor. The remaining 4 opened fire, but Jin-Woo had already anticipated their reaction. He used the falling man's body as a shield while diving behind an overturned table, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if conjured from thin air. The sound of gunfire echoed off the restaurant's walls, mixing with screams and the crash of breaking china. Arya watched him work with professional admiration. Every movement was calculated, every shot placed with deadly accuracy. This wasn't the desperate fighting of a cornered animal. This was the methodical elimination of threats by someone who had spent years perfecting the art of violence. But even predators could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. She saw the moment when the mathematics of the situation shifted against him. One of the Russians had circled behind his position, using the chaos to gain a flanking angle. Jin was focused on the 3 men in front of him, trusting his spatial awareness to warn him of threats from other directions. He couldn't see what Arya could see from her position behind the bar. The fourth man raising his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger, muzzle aimed at the back of Jean Wu's head. Later, she would tell herself that her decision was pure instinct, that her combat training had taken over before her rational mind could assess the risks. The truth was simpler and more complex. Something about the way he carried himself, the controlled grace even in the midst of deadly violence, had sparked recognition in her. Not attraction, though that would come later. Recognition of a fellow survivor, someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters through skill and determination rather than luck or privilege. She moved without conscious thought, her server's knowledge of the restaurant's layout guiding her through the maze of overturned furniture. The emergency fire extinguisher was exactly where it should be, mounted on the wall beside the kitchen doors. Its weight felt substantial in her hands as she approached the Russian from his blind spot. The impact of solid metal against the base of his skull dropped him instantly. His rifle clattered away across the marble floor as he collapsed, and suddenly the odds had shifted. Jean Wu spun at the sound, his weapon tracking toward her position before his eyes registered her as an ally rather than a threat. Their gazes met across the ruins of what had been an elegant dining room. In that moment, Arya saw something flicker behind his controlled facade. Not surprised at her intervention, though that was there too. Something deeper. Recognition matching her own. Acknowledgement that she had just tied her fate to his in ways neither of them fully understood. The remaining three Russians realized their tactical advantage had evaporated. Whatever had brought them to this restaurant tonight, whoever had sent them after Jinwoo Park, they hadn't planned for civilian interference. Their retreat was as professional as their attack had been, covering each other as they moved toward the shattered front entrance, leaving their unconscious colleague behind. Jinwoo didn't pursue them. His attention had shifted entirely to the young woman who stood among the wreckage, fire extinguisher still clutched in steady hands, dark eyes meeting his with the kind of calm that spoke of experience with violence and its aftermath. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Soon the restaurant would be flooded with police, paramedics, crime scene investigators. Questions would be asked that neither of them particularly wanted to answer. The normal world was reasserting itself, demanding explanations and statements and paperwork that would complicate everything. But for now, in the space between heartbeats, there is only the weight of shared danger and the recognition that some encounters change everything that comes after. Arya Thompson had spent 3 years serving tables and avoiding complications. Jinwoo Park had spent his adult life maintaining careful distance between his world and the ordinary lives around him. Neither of them knew it yet, but that distance had just collapsed entirely. The police interview room smelled of stale coffee and institutional disinfectant, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Detective Morrison's weathered face. Arya had been answering the same questions for 3 hours, her story never wavering from the careful truth she had constructed. She was a waitress who had hidden during the attack, who had seen very little through the chaos, who knew nothing about the well-dressed Korean man who had somehow survived what appeared to be a professional assassination attempt. She did not mention the fire extinguisher. She did not mention the moment their eyes had met across the destroyed dining room. She certainly did not mention the way his presence had lingered in her mind during the sleepless hours since the attack, the memory of controlled lethality wrapped in expensive tailoring. The detective closed his notebook with the weary resignation of a man who recognized a dead end when he encountered one. 4 witnesses for nearly identical statements about hiding and seeing nothing useful. The restaurant security cameras had been mysteriously disabled minutes before the attack, suggesting a level of planning that made this far more than a simple robbery gone wrong. Arya walked out of the police station into a gray Seattle morning that felt fundamentally different from the one she had left behind. The world looked the same, but she moved through it with the heightened awareness of someone who understood how quickly normalcy could shatter. Every face in the crowd might belong to an enemy she hadn't yet identified. Every car that lingered too long at a traffic light might contain threats she couldn't anticipate. She had lived with hypervigilance before, during her deployment, and in the months afterward when loud noises could send her diving for cover. She had thought that chapter of her life was closed, that she had successfully returned to the civilian world where her biggest concerns were exam schedules and rent payments. Last night had reminded her that some skills, once learned, never truly disappeared. The apartment building where she had lived for 2 years looked smaller somehow, its security measures suddenly inadequate. A single deadbolt lock and a door chain that any determined intruder could bypass in seconds. Windows that faced the street, offering clear sight lines for anyone conducting surveillance. She had chosen the place for its affordability and proximity to the university, not for its defensive capabilities. Her grandmother's voice crackled through the phone when Arya called to check in, the familiar warmth a stark contrast to the cold calculation that had dominated her thoughts since leaving the police station. 3 generations of women living independently, taking care of themselves and each other without relying on anyone else. It was a point of pride that had sustained them through poverty and loss and the 1,000 small indignities that came with being black women in spaces that weren't designed for their success. That pride felt fragile now, threatened by circumstances beyond her control. The knock on her door came at exactly noon, 3 measured raps that somehow conveyed both courtesy and inevitability. Arya checked the peephole and found herself looking at 2 men in dark suits, their posture radiating the kind of professional alertness that had nothing to do with selling insurance or conducting surveys. She recognized the type from her military days. Private security, the expensive kind that wealthy people hired when they needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. She opened the door with the chain still engaged, meeting their patient gazes through the narrow gap. The older of the 2 men spoke in accented English, his tone respectful but implacable. "Mr. Park requests the pleasure of your company for lunch. There are matters of mutual interest that require discussion." The phrasing was polite enough, but Arya heard the underlying message clearly. This was not actually a request, and declining was not actually an option. She considered her alternatives with the same tactical mindset that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. Fighting was futile against trained professionals who had chosen the time and place of this encounter. Running would only delay the inevitable, while marking her as uncooperative. Her best chance lay in appearing compliant while gathering information about what Jean-Woo Park actually wanted from her. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that projected competence rather than vulnerability. Dark jeans, sturdy boots, a leather jacket that could conceal defensive movements if necessary. The small canister of pepper spray went into her pocket, though she harbored no illusions about its effectiveness against men of this caliber. The restaurant they chose was nothing like Hanbok, its atmosphere casual enough that other diners paid no attention to their table in the corner. Jean-Woo Park looked exactly as controlled as he had the night before, though daylight revealed details that chaos had obscured. The precise way he handled his chopsticks, the quality of his watch, the manner in which his security team positioned themselves to monitor all approaches without appearing obvious about it. He waited until she had ordered, until the server had moved away from their table, before speaking. "Last night you saved my life. This creates certain complications that must be addressed." Arya met his steady gaze without flinching. "I was protecting myself. You were just in the same general area." A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first crack she had seen in his professional facade. "You moved like someone with training. Former military, I would guess. Combat experience." The accuracy of his assessment sent a chill through her, but she kept her expression neutral. "A lot of people have military experience. It doesn't make them special." "No," he agreed, his tone thoughtful. "But most people with military experience do not work as waitresses in restaurants frequented by men like me. Most people with your particular skills would have found more lucrative applications for their talents." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. He had done his research in the hours since their encounter. He knew about her deployment, her medical discharge, probably her financial situation and family obligations. Information that should have been private had become tactical intelligence in the hands of someone with resources she could barely imagine. Her silence seemed to satisfy him, confirming what he had already deduced. The men who attacked last night were Russian. Members of the Bratva seeking to expand their territorial control into areas that have been traditionally managed by other organizations. Your intervention disrupted their operation and saved my life, which makes you both a witness and a potential target. Arya forced herself to remain calm despite the cold fear spreading through her chest. Why would they care about me? I'm nobody to them. Because they cannot be certain what you saw or heard during the attack. Because they cannot know whether you might identify them to law enforcement. Because leaving loose ends is not how professional organizations maintain their security. His voice remained conversational, but the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. They will attempt to eliminate you as a potential threat to their operation. The casual way he delivered this death sentence made it somehow more terrifying than if he had tried to frighten her deliberately. This was simply fact, delivered with the same emotional inflection he might use to discuss weather patterns or stock prices. What do you want from me? Her voice remained steady despite everything. A small victory over circumstance. I'm offering you protection. A place to stay where their reach cannot extend. Security measures that will keep you safe while my people resolve this territorial dispute. In exchange, you will refrain from discussing last night's events with law enforcement or anyone else. Arya stared at him across the table, recognizing the trap even as he laid it out with perfect clarity. Accepting his protection meant entering his world, becoming dependent on someone whose business required the kind of violence she had witnessed. Refusing meant facing trained killers with nothing but her own resources and whatever help the overloaded Seattle Police Department might provide. I have a life, she said finally. School, work, family obligations. I can't just disappear because you think someone might want to hurt me. Your life, as it existed yesterday, is over, he replied with gentle finality. The question now is whether your new life will be brief and violent, or whether you will accept the opportunity to adapt to changed circumstances. The bluntness of it struck her like a physical blow. 3 years of careful planning, of working double shifts and saving every possible dollar, of building toward a future that would lift her family out of poverty and provide the stability her grandmother deserved. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife because she had made a split-second decision to help a stranger. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, but she pushed the emotion aside in favor of practical considerations. How long? Until the territorial dispute is resolved and the threat level returns to acceptable parameters. Weeks, possibly longer. And if I refuse, then I will respect your decision and wish you the best of luck with whatever security arrangements you choose to make independently. His tone suggested that he already knew what those prospects looked like, and that they were not encouraging. Arya looked around the restaurant at people living ordinary lives, making ordinary decisions, unaware that their world contained men like Jin-Woo Park and the violence that followed in his wake. Yesterday, she had been one of them, worried about exam schedules and rent payments, and whether she could afford new textbooks for next semester. The choice, when stripped of illusion, was no choice at all. She could cling to the fiction of her independent life while trained killers hunted her through the streets of Seattle. Or she could accept the protection of a man whose mere presence commanded the kind of respect that came from demonstrated lethality. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival required pragmatism, even when pragmatism tasted like defeat. Where? She asked, the single word carrying the weight of surrender. Somewhere safe, he replied, and something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. Somewhere they cannot reach you. The car that arrived to collect her belongings was black and expensive, its windows tinted dark enough to conceal its occupants. Arya watched her neighborhood disappear through the passenger window, each familiar landmark carrying the weight of goodbye. She did not know when she would see any of it again, or whether the person who eventually returned would be recognizably the same woman who was leaving. Jin-Woo Park sat beside her in silence, his presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling. He had been correct about the mathematics of her situation, but correctness did not make the trap any less complete. She was trading one form of captivity for another, hoping that the devil she was choosing to know would prove more benevolent than the one she was fleeing. The compound that emerged from the trees north of the city looked like something from an entirely different world. High walls topped with sophisticated security systems, guards who moved with military precision, buildings that blended luxury with fortress-like defensibility. This was where powerful men retreated when the ordinary world became too dangerous for their presence. This was her new home, whether she had chosen it or not. The guest suite Jean Wu had assigned her was larger than her entire apartment, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of meticulously maintained gardens that stretched toward the tree line. Arya stood at those windows for long minutes each morning, watching the compound wake up around her, studying the routines and rhythms of a world that operated according to rules she was only beginning to understand. Security patrols moved with clockwork precision along predetermined routes. Kitchen staff arrived before dawn to prepare meals that would feed not just Jean Wu and his immediate household, but the rotating shifts of guards and administrative personnel who kept his organization functioning. There were gardeners and maintenance crews, drivers and communication specialists, all moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood their roles in a larger machine. It was, she realized, not so different from a military base. The same attention to procedure, the same understanding that individual safety depended on collective discipline, the same way that everyone knew their place in the hierarchy and respected the chain of command that kept everything running smoothly. Jean Wu himself was the calm center around which all this activity revolved. She saw him throughout each day, moving between meetings and phone calls, receiving reports, and issuing instructions with the kind of quiet authority that made subordinates listen carefully to every word. He wore his power like a well-tailored suit, so naturally that it seemed inseparable from his physical presence. But there were moments, brief flickers when he thought no one was watching, where the mask slipped just enough to reveal something more complex beneath. The way his shoulders tightened when he received certain phone calls. The careful distance he maintained from most of his own people, as if genuine connection were a luxury too dangerous to afford. The way he would sometimes pause in doorways, seeming to weigh whether the space beyond was worth entering. Arya had been in his compound for 4 days when the opportunity to prove her value presented itself. She was reading in the main library, working her way through a collection of medical journals that Jean Wu had somehow procured for her, when shouting erupted from the courtyard outside. Through the tall windows, she saw 2 men carrying a third between them, blood streaming for what appeared to be a significant laceration across his forearm. Her combat medic training overrode every other consideration. She was moving before conscious thought could interfere, following the men toward what she assumed would be the compound's medical facility. Instead, they carried their injured colleague into Jean Wu's office, where she found him clearing papers from his desk to make room for treatment. The wound was deep but manageable, the kind of injury that looked worse than it actually was due to the volume of blood involved. Arya assessed the situation with professional detachment, noting the location of major vessels and the likelihood of permanent damage. The man was conscious and alert, more frustrated than frightened by his condition. Jean Wu looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from concern for his employee to surprise at her presence. She did not wait for permission or explanation. The first aid kit mounted on his office wall was military grade, equipped for serious trauma rather than minor scrapes. She pulled it down and began organizing supplies with practiced efficiency. "I can help," she said simply, meeting Jean Wu's gaze. "I have medical training." He studied her for a moment that stretched longer than the injured man's condition warranted, then stepped back to give her access to his desk. His compliance carried the weight of decision rather than desperation. He was choosing to trust her competence rather than being forced to accept her assistance. Arya worked quickly and methodically, cleaning the wound and assessing the damage with hands that had performed similar procedures under much worse conditions. The cut was clean, probably from broken glass or sharp metal rather than a deliberate weapon. It would require stitches, but posed no immediate threat to life or limb. The injured man relaxed under her care, responding to the calm confidence in her voice as she explained each step of the treatment process. She had learned early in her military career that patients healed faster when they understood what was happening to them, when fear of the unknown was replaced by comprehension of the manageable. Jean Wu watched her work without comment, but she could feel the weight of his attention, the way he cataloged every movement and decision. She was being evaluated. She realized her competence measured against some internal standard he used to assess the people around him. The stitching required concentration and precision, qualities that had kept her steady during much more challenging procedures in field hospitals where mortar rounds provided an irregular percussion section to emergency surgery. This was almost peaceful by comparison, the main difficulty being the adjustment of working with proper lighting and adequate supplies after years of civilian life. When she finished, the man's arm was properly bandaged and immobilized, the bleeding stopped, and the risk of infection minimized. He would need to keep the area clean and dry, avoid strain for several days, return for suture removal in approximately 10 days. Standard post-procedure instructions delivered with the same professional manner she had used with wounded soldiers who needed to understand their limitations. The man thanked her in accented English before his colleagues helped him from the office, leaving Arya alone with Jean Wu in a space that suddenly felt much smaller than its actual dimensions. She became acutely aware of the blood on her hands, the way her hair had fallen loose from its ponytail during the procedure, the fact that she had just demonstrated capabilities that raised questions she might not want to answer. Military medic, Jean Wu said, his tone making it a statement rather than a question. Combat experience. Afghanistan or Iraq? Afghanistan. Her response was automatic, delivered before she could consider whether honesty was strategically wise. 2 tours. Forward operating bases where the nearest proper medical facility was sometimes hours away. He nodded slowly, as if her background explained something he had been wondering about. That level of training is not easily acquired, or easily forgotten. No, she agreed. It isn't. The silence that followed carried a different quality than the polite distance they had maintained during their previous interactions. Something had shifted, some barrier had been crossed without either of them quite meaning to cross it. She had revealed herself to be more than he had assumed, and his acknowledgement of that fact created a new category for their relationship. "You must be hungry," he said finally, his tone formal enough to rebuild some of the distance that had narrowed. "Dinner is usually served at 7. I would be honored if you would join me." The invitation was phrased as a courtesy, but Arya heard the underlying current that made it more significant than simple politeness. This was not the offer of employer to employee or protector to protected. This was something closer to recognition between equals, an acknowledgement that she had earned consideration beyond her circumstances. The private dining room where they met that evening was smaller than she had expected, its atmosphere more intimate than intimidating. Jean Wu had changed from his business attire into dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the casual clothing somehow making him seem both more and less approachable, more human in scale, but less predictable in the absence of his professional armor. The meal itself was a revelation in subtle luxury. Each course appeared as if conjured by invisible staff, the presentation museum quality, the flavors layered with the kind of complexity that spoke of serious culinary training. Jean Wu ate with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else, but she noticed the way he watched her reactions to each dish, gauging her responses with what seemed like genuine curiosity. They spoke carefully at first, trading observations about food and weather and other neutral topics that allowed conversation without requiring dangerous revelations. But gradually, perhaps influenced by excellent wine or simply the strange intimacy of sharing a meal in isolation, their words began carrying more weight. He told her about the compound's history, how it had been built by a tech entrepreneur who had later discovered that isolation and security came at the price of profound loneliness. How Jean Wu had acquired the property when his own circumstances required retreat from more public venues. How he sometimes wondered whether safety purchased at the cost of genuine human connection was actually safety at all. She found herself describing her grandmother's garden in Alabama. The way morning glories climbed the chain-link fence and transformed something utilitarian into something beautiful. The pride her family took in growing their own vegetables, in being self-sufficient even when resources were limited. The way her grandmother hummed while she worked, turning labor into something approaching prayer. The conversation meandered through personal history and philosophical observation, touching on subjects that should have remained safely theoretical but somehow felt urgent in the space they had created. What constituted home when geography became dangerous? Whether strength was something you possessed or something you practiced. How people adapted when the foundations of their world shifted without warning. Jean Wu refilled her wine glass with movements that spoke of long practice with hospitality, but his attention remained focused entirely on her words. She had the strange sensation that he was listening not just to what she said, but to what she chose not to say, reading the gaps and hesitations for information she had not consciously intended to share. "You miss it," he observed when she described her work at the trauma center before deployment. "The medicine, the ability to fix what was broken." Sometimes, she admitted, but medicine in civilian life is different. More bureaucracy, less immediacy. "Sometimes I think I was better suited to crisis situations than routine care. There are many opportunities for crisis management in my line of work," he said, and something in his tone made the statement an offer rather than mere observation. "People with your skills are always valuable." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clearly understood. He was not just offering her temporary safety. He was suggesting a future that would make use of her capabilities, that would value her for what she could contribute rather than simply what she needed protected from. The possibility should have alarmed her, should have triggered every alarm about becoming entangled with dangerous men and their violent enterprises. Instead, she found herself considering the proposal with the same tactical mindset that had guided her through combat zones. What would such an arrangement cost her? What would it provide? How would it change the trajectory of her life? Later, walking back through corridors lit by soft sconces that created pools of warm light and intimate shadows, she became aware of Jean Wu's presence beside her in ways that had nothing to do with security arrangements or practical cooperation. The way he matched his pace to hers without seeming to think about it. The scent of his cologne, something understated and expensive that made her want to move closer rather than maintain professional distance. At her door, he paused, and she turned to find him studying her with an expression she could not quite interpret. The controlled mask had slipped again, revealing something more complex underneath. Interest, certainly. Appreciation for capabilities he had not expected to discover. But beneath those surface responses, something that might have been longing, quickly suppressed, but not quite quickly enough to escape her notice. "Sleep well," he said simply, but his voice carried currents that had nothing to do with polite wishes for restful slumber. Alone in her suite, Arya stood again at the tall windows, looking out at gardens bathed in moonlight and security lighting. The compound felt different now, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary where dangerous people could afford to lower their guard, where strength could be acknowledged without being treated as a threat, where the careful distance required for survival could occasionally be relaxed in favor of genuine human connection. She was beginning to understand why Jean Wu had built walls around himself, and why he might be willing to lower them for someone who had proven herself worthy of trust. The recognition was mutual and dangerous, carrying implications that neither of them had planned for, but both were too intelligent to ignore. Something was growing between them in the spaces created by proximity and shared danger, something that would reshape everything that came after. She could feel it in the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, in the way his attention lingered on her when he thought she was not watching, in the careful courtesy that was beginning to carry warmer undertones. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new challenges to navigate and decisions to make. But tonight, for For the first time since arriving at his compound, she felt the possibility that safety and connection might not be mutually exclusive. That protection might evolve into something deeper and more voluntary than either of them had initially intended. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with something dangerously close to hope. The explosion of glass and Chinese porcelain against the office wall punctuated Arya's words with a violence that made both security guards outside the door take a step back. She had not intended to throw Jean Wu's expensive tea set, had not planned for her frustration to manifest in such dramatic fashion, but the sound of destruction felt satisfyingly final in a way that words alone could not achieve. "You cannot keep me here like some exotic pet," she said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had reached the absolute limit of her patience. "I am not a possession to be managed or a problem to be contained. I am a grown woman with obligations and responsibilities that extend beyond your need to feel like you are protecting me." Jean Wu regarded her from behind his desk with the same unreadable expression he brought to business negotiations, though she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had found their mark. The broken ceramic scattered across his polished floor seemed to amuse rather than anger him, as if her loss of control revealed something he had been waiting to see. 2 weeks, 14 days of careful courtesy and patient cooperation while her entire life crumbled beyond these walls. Her grandmother's medical appointments missed because Arya could not risk leaving the compound. Her nursing school semester abandoned because extended absences raised questions she could not answer. Her carefully constructed future dissolving because Jean Wu had decided her safety was more important than her autonomy. The breaking point had come that morning when she discovered that her access to outside communication had been restricted without consultation or explanation. No phone calls to family members. No internet access that was not filtered through his security protocols. No contact with the outside world except what he deemed necessary and appropriate. It was protection taken to the point of imprisonment, control disguised as care, and she had endured it for as long as her pride would allow. "Your restrictions are necessary," Jean Wu said, his tone reasonable in a way that made her want to throw something else. "The Bratva has expanded their search parameters. Intercepted communications suggest they have identified you as a target and are actively seeking your location. Then teach me to defend myself instead of treating me like I am helpless," she shot back. "Give me weapons, training, information. Let me be part of my own protection instead of something that needs to be hidden away like a shameful secret." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise that suggested her response had been unexpected. "You already have training, medical skills that saved the life of one of my men. But combat capabilities require years of development under controlled conditions." Arya laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut. "You think I learned field medicine by reading textbooks? You think I kept soldiers alive in forward operating bases without learning to keep myself alive first?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for the magnitude of her admission to settle between them. She had revealed more than she had intended, exposed capabilities that would change how he thought about her and her situation. But pride and frustration had overridden tactical considerations, and there was no retrieving words once spoken. "Show me," Jean Wu said simply, rising from his desk with fluid grace. "What?" "Show me what you learned in Afghanistan. Prove that my restrictions are based on incorrect assumptions about your capabilities." The challenge in his voice sparked something dangerous in her chest, a competitive fire that had kept her alive when conditions became impossible and resources ran out. She had spent 2 weeks being careful and compliant, accepting his protection while chafing against its limitations. Now he was offering her the opportunity to demonstrate that those limitations were based on underestimation rather than reality. The training facility in the compound's basement was military grade, equipped with everything from basic fitness equipment to sophisticated combat simulation systems. Jean Wu had changed into workout clothes that revealed the lean muscle definition of someone who maintained peak physical condition through discipline rather than vanity. Arya wore the tactical clothing she had brought from her apartment, gear that felt like returning to a familiar skin after weeks of civilian softness. They began with basic hand-to-hand techniques, movements that would have been routine during her military training but felt rusty after 3 years of civilian life. Jin-woo moved like water given form, his strikes controlled and precise, his defense seeming almost casual in its effectiveness. But as Arya settled into the rhythm of combat, muscle memory reasserted itself with startling clarity. She had been good at this once. More than good. Exceptional in ways that had kept her alive when luck and training were the only things standing between survival and catastrophe. The movements felt natural again, her body remembering lessons that her conscious mind had tried to forget. Jin-woo's respect for her capabilities became evident in the way he adjusted his own technique, increasing the intensity and complexity of their exchanges as she demonstrated her competence. This was no longer an evaluation of basic self-defense skills. This was a genuine sparring session between trained professionals who understood the mathematics of violence and respected each other's expertise. The breakthrough came when he attempted a grappling technique that would have ended the match in his favor if she had been the helpless civilian he had initially assumed. Instead, she countered with a move that used his own momentum against him, sending him to the mat with enough force to demonstrate that she could have seriously injured him if she had chosen to do so. They lay on the training mat afterward, breathing hard and staring at the ceiling, the space between them charged with something that had nothing to do with combat adrenaline and everything to do with the recognition of equals who had tested each other and found the experience profoundly satisfying. "Where did you learn that last sequence?" Jin-woo asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than professional assessment. "Close quarters combat instructor at Fort Bragg," she replied, not bothering to hide the pride in her voice. "Special operations medics get additional training because we sometimes have to fight our way to wounded soldiers before we can treat them." The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous territory. She had revealed capabilities that placed her in an entirely different category from the civilians who usually required his protection. More than that, she had demonstrated that her resentment of his restrictions was based on legitimate expertise rather than naive overconfidence. Jin-woo turned onto his side to study her profile, his expression thoughtful in ways that made her acutely aware of their proximity, of the way exercise had brought them into a kind of intimate physical space that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. "You could have told me this 2 weeks ago. Would it have changed anything?" she asked, meeting his gaze with a directness that made something flicker in his dark eyes. The question seemed to require more consideration than she had expected. Jin-woo was quiet for long moments, weighing implications and possibilities with the same careful attention he brought to business decisions. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of genuine revelation. "Yes," he said simply, "it would have changed everything." The admission created a new kind of silence between them, one that acknowledged how fundamentally their dynamic would need to shift in light of what he now understood about her capabilities. She was not just someone who needed protection. She was someone who could contribute to her own protection, who could be trusted with information and decision-making responsibilities that he had previously reserved for trained personnel. But recognition of her competence created new complications, new tensions that had nothing to do with safety protocols and everything to do with the growing attraction neither of them had been willing to acknowledge directly. Seeing her move with lethal grace, understanding the depth of her training and experience, had changed how he looked at her in ways that went far beyond professional respect. The walk back to the main house felt different, charged with possibilities that had not existed an hour earlier. Jin-woo's attention to her carried new weight, appreciation layered with something that might have been desire if either of them had been willing to name it directly. Arya found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the way controlled strength moved beneath his casual clothing, of the respectful distance he maintained despite the intimacy their sparring had created. That evening's dinner carried none of the careful politeness that had characterized their previous meals together. Instead, there was a quality of honest assessment, two professionals evaluating each other's capabilities and considering how those capabilities might work in combination. Jean Wu shared information about the ongoing search for her, about the resources the Bratva had committed to finding and eliminating witnesses to their failed assassination attempt. 3 safe houses compromised in the past week, he told her, his tone clinical despite the implications. They have tracked down and questioned several people who were in the restaurant that night. They are being methodical and thorough. What happened to those people? She asked, though his expression had already provided the answer. What usually happens to people who have information that hostile organizations want to suppress? The weight of those deaths settled on her shoulders like lead. People had died because she had chosen to help him, because her intervention had turned a simple assassination into a complicated problem that required extensive cleanup. Her decision to act had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her own safety or his. "I am sorry," Jean Wu said softly, reading the guilt in her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. "This is not a burden you should carry. The responsibility belongs to those who chose violence as a solution to territorial disputes." But his reassurance could not lift the weight entirely. She was connected to this now, implicated in a world where protective measures could not extend to everyone who might become collateral damage, where survival sometimes required accepting that other people would pay the price for choices they had never been given the opportunity to make. Later, standing at her window and looking out at the moonlit gardens, Arya tried to process the day's revelations and their implications. Jean Wu now understood her capabilities, which meant her restrictions would change. But increased freedom would come with increased responsibility, deeper integration into a world she had never intended to enter. The soft knock on her door came just as the compound security lights shifted to their overnight configuration, casting different shadows across the grounds outside. She opened it to find Jean Wu in the hallway, still wearing the white shirt from dinner, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly disheveled in ways that made him seem more approachable than his usual controlled perfection. "I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble, "for underestimating your capabilities, for making decisions about your safety without consulting you, for treating you like someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who could be trusted with information and choices." The apology was more than she had expected, delivered with a sincerity that seemed to cost him something. Men in his position, she realized, probably did not apologize often or easily. The fact that he was doing so now spoke to how significantly her demonstration that afternoon had shifted his understanding of their situation. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate to address everything that had changed between them. "Tomorrow we will discuss new arrangements," he continued. "Security protocols that account for your training. Information sharing that allows you to make informed decisions about acceptable risk levels. A role in your own protection that reflects your actual capabilities rather than my assumptions about civilian limitations." She nodded, recognizing the offer for what it was. Not just modified restrictions, but genuine partnership in managing the threat against her. Trust that extended beyond physical safety to include judgment and decision-making authority. But as he turned to leave, some impulse made her reach out, her fingers catching his wrist in a gesture that stopped him mid-motion. The contact sent electricity through her palm, awareness of his skin and warmth, and the controlled strength just beneath the surface. "Jean Wu," she said, her voice carrying questions she was not quite ready to voice directly. He turned back, his dark eyes searching her face for meaning she was not certain she was prepared to share. The space between them felt charged with possibility and danger, with the recognition that protection had evolved into something more complex and potentially more destructive than either of them had planned. "Yes." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the way his pulse jumped beneath her fingers, the way his breathing had shifted in response to her touch. "Nothing," she said finally, releasing his wrist and stepping back into the safety of distance. "Just thank you for listening, for changing your mind." He studied her for a moment that stretched longer than politeness required, as if memorizing details he might need to reference later. Then he nodded once and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway with the memory of his skin against her palm and the growing certainty that the most dangerous thing in her new world might not be the Russian assassins hunting her. It might be the way Jean-Woo Park looked at her when he thought she was not watching, and the way her pulse quickened in response to that attention. The way protection was beginning to feel like something she might choose rather than something being imposed upon her. The way survival was becoming complicated by the possibility of wanting more than just safety from the man who had made himself responsible for providing it. The first mortar round struck the compound's east wall at 3:17 in the morning, its detonation tearing through Aria's sleep with the familiar sound of incoming artillery that sent her rolling from bed to floor before conscious thought could interfere. Her combat training reasserted itself instantly, muscle memory overriding 3 years of civilian softness as she assessed the situation through the tactical lens that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. Multiple explosions, coordinated timing, professional assault rather than opportunistic attack. The Russians had found them. She dressed in tactical clothing with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic as her mind calculated defensive positions and escape routes. The compound security system was already active, red emergency lights bathing the corridors in harsh illumination, while automated announcements provided status updates in multiple languages. Jean-Woo's organization was responding with military precision, but Aria could hear the intensity of incoming fire increasing with each passing minute. Jean-Woo appeared in her doorway before she had finished lacing her boots, his own appearance suggesting he had been awake and monitoring security feeds when the attack began. He wore black tactical gear that transformed him from businessman to soldier, weapons and equipment arranged with the familiarity of someone who had done this many times before. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The safe room is behind the bookcase. Reinforced walls, independent communication system, supplies for 72 hours. My people will handle this." "Like hell," Aria replied, checking the load on the sidearm she had requisitioned from his armory after their sparring session. "You said I was part of my own protection now. That means I fight." The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer, punctuated by shouted commands in Russian and the crash of breaching charges. Whatever defensive perimeter Jean-Woo's men had established was being systematically dismantled by attackers who had come prepared for serious resistance. "This is not a discussion," Jean-Woo said, but uncertainty flickered in his dark eyes as he weighed her capabilities against the magnitude of threat bearing down on them. "No, it is not," Aria agreed, moving past him toward the corridor. "Because we both know you need every trained fighter you can get, and we both know I'm qualified to help." The compound's main floor had been transformed into a war zone, furniture overturned to create improvised defensive positions while Jean-Woo's security team engaged attackers who had breached the perimeter at multiple points. Aria counted at least 15 Russians moving with tactical coordination that spoke of military training and extensive planning. They had come to eliminate witnesses and were prepared to fight through whatever resistance they encountered. Jean-Woo moved through the chaos like a force of nature, given human form, his weapons seeming to find targets with supernatural accuracy while he coordinated defensive efforts through his throat microphone. He was magnificent in combat, Aria realized, every movement flowing into the next with deadly efficiency. This was what he had been before wealth and organization required him to delegate violence to others. This was the predator who had earned the respect and fear that made other dangerous men step aside. But even predators could be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The Russians had brought enough personnel and equipment to siege the compound if necessary, and Jean-Woo's defensive force was designed to repel opportunistic attacks rather than full-scale military assault. Aria found her position behind an overturned marble table that provided cover while offering clear sight lines to multiple approach routes. Her rifle felt comfortable in her hands, the weight and balance familiar from countless hours of training and combat deployment. She settled into the controlled, breathing rhythm that allowed precision shooting under stress, her heart rate slowing as adrenaline sharpened her focus to laser intensity. The first Russian who entered her field of fire went down with a chest shot that dropped him instantly. The second managed 2 steps before her follow-up round found its mark. Professional soldiers, she noted clinically, but not expecting resistance from someone with her level of training. Jean Wu's voice crackled through the communication system, coordinating movement and target priorities with the efficiency of someone accustomed to command under pressure. But Arya could hear the strain beneath his controlled tone, the recognition that this assault was larger and better organized than his intelligence had anticipated. North Corridor compromised, his voice reported. Multiple contacts advancing toward main stairwell. On it, Arya responded, moving from her position with the fluid grace of someone who had learned urban combat in places where mistakes were measured in body counts. The stairwell had become a fatal funnel where Russian attackers were attempting to advance to the upper floors where they believed their targets were located. Arya positioned herself at the top landing, using architectural advantages to create overlapping fields of fire that would force attackers to expose themselves if they wanted to continue their advance. The next few minutes blurred together into controlled violence that defined close-quarters combat. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with blood and fear. Russians advanced with professional determination, while Jean Wu's defenders fought with the desperate efficiency of men protecting their home ground. Arya worked with mechanical precision, each shot placed with the accuracy that had kept wounded soldiers alive by eliminating threats before they could complete their objectives. She was not thinking about the men she was killing, was not processing the humanity of her targets. That emotional reckoning would come later, in quiet moments when survival no longer depended on the ability to treat other human beings as tactical problems requiring permanent solutions. The breakthrough came when explosions echoed from the compound's rear section, suggesting the Russians had successfully breached defensive positions that Jean Wu had considered secure. His voice over the communication system carried new urgency as he redirected personnel to address threats that were penetrating deeper into areas that should have been protected. Arya was reloading when she heard footsteps on the service stairs behind her position, the metallic sound of equipment and weapons that did not belong to Jean Wu's people. She had been flanked, her focus on the main stairwell allowing attackers to approach through secondary routes she had not adequately covered. She spun toward the new threat as 3 Russians emerged from the service stairwell, their weapons already trained on her position. Time slowed with the adrenaline clarity that came in moments when survival depended on reactions measured in fractions of seconds. Her rifle was too slow for this range. The knife on her belt required closing distance she did not have time to cover. The situation had become mathematically impossible, physics and geometry combining to create circumstances where training and experience could not overcome tactical disadvantage. The first Russian was squeezing his trigger when Jean Wu appeared behind them like death given physical form, his weapon speaking with controlled precision that dropped all 3 men before they could complete their attack. He had abandoned his command position to come for her, had left his defensive coordination to other people because her safety had become more important than tactical efficiency. "Behind you," she warned, seeing movement in the main stairwell that indicated more attackers were advancing while Jean Wu's attention was focused on her immediate threat. They moved together then, back to back in the classic defensive formation that doubled their effective coverage while allowing mutual support. Arya had worked with partners before, had developed the trust and communication necessary for coordinated combat, but nothing had prepared her for the seamless integration she found with Jean Wu. He anticipated her movements before she made them, shifted his position to cover angles she was about to expose, created space for her to maneuver while maintaining his own defensive responsibilities. It was as if they had trained together for years rather than discovering their compatibility in the middle of active combat. The remaining attackers realized that their assault had encountered resistance far more sophisticated than they had planned for, that what should have been a simple execution had become a costly siege with uncertain outcomes. Their withdrawal was professional but hasty, covered by suppressing fire that kept defenders in position while they extracted personnel and equipment. Silence, when it finally came, felt strange after the sustained violence of the past hour. Aria's ears rang with the aftereffects of close-quarters gunfire, and her hands trembled slightly as adrenaline began metabolizing into exhaustion. Around them, the compound bore scars that would require extensive repair, but the structure had held and the defenders had prevailed. Jean Wu was checking her for injuries with hands that moved too quickly, too urgently, his professional composure cracking under stress that had nothing to do with tactical considerations and everything to do with the recognition of how close he had come to losing her. "Are you hurt?" His voice carried desperation he was trying to suppress, fear that had overwhelmed the controlled authority he usually maintained. "I am fine," she assured him, catching his hands to still their frantic movement. "We're both fine." But his dark eyes were wide with something that looked like terror, and she realized that her near-death experience had shattered emotional walls he had spent years constructing. The mask of professional distance had been completely destroyed by the moment when he thought he might watch her die. "I cannot do this," he said, his voice breaking in ways that revealed how completely his control had been compromised. "I cannot watch people try to kill you. I cannot coordinate defensive operations while knowing that you're in danger. I cannot function when your safety is at risk." The admission hung between them in the aftermath of violence, raw and honest in ways that normal conversation never allowed. Jean Wu Park, who commanded respect through demonstrated lethality, who managed complex criminal enterprises through careful emotional distance, had been reduced to fundamental terror by the possibility of her death. "Jean Wu," she said softly, reaching up to frame his face with hands that still smelled of gunpowder and carried the tremor of recent combat. "I love you," he said, the words torn from him with the force of confession under torture. "I did not plan this. I did not want this. But watching you fight, seeing your courage, nearly losing you tonight, I cannot pretend anymore that this is just protection or professional respect or mutual attraction that can be managed through careful distance. The declaration should have complicated everything, should have introduced new dangers and ethical considerations that would make their situation even more impossible to navigate. Instead, it felt like the only honest response to what had grown between them through proximity and shared danger and mutual recognition of capabilities that complemented each other perfectly. "I love you too," she replied, the admission surprising her with its ease, with how completely it felt like truth she had been avoiding rather than revelation she was discovering. They kissed then, amid the wreckage of his compound and the aftermath of violence that had nearly destroyed them both. It tasted of desperation and relief and the particular intensity that came from surviving shared danger. It felt like coming home to a place she had never known she was looking for. The compound's communication system crackled with reports from Jean Wu's security teams, damage assessments, and casualty reports that would require his attention and decision-making authority. But for these few moments, he ignored those responsibilities in favor of holding her close enough to convince himself that she was real and safe and had not been taken from him by men who saw her only as a problem requiring violent solution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to assess and countermeasures to implement. The Russians would regroup and develop different approaches, and Jean Wu's organization would need to adapt to a level of threat that exceeded their previous security parameters. But tonight, in the space between heartbeats and the aftermath of survival, there was only the recognition that protection had evolved into something deeper and more dangerous than either of them had intended. That love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances and flourish despite conditions that should have made it impossible. That sometimes the most dangerous man in the world could become the safest place for a woman who had learned to fight her own battles, but had never learned that she did not have to fight them alone. 3 weeks after the assault, the compound had been restored to its previous elegance. Those subtle modifications spoke of lessons learned through violence. Reinforced windows, enhanced security systems, tactical positions that had been formalized into architectural features. The Russian threat had been eliminated with the surgical precision that Jean Wu brought to all problems requiring permanent solutions. But the experience had changed more than just defensive protocols. Arya stood in the main office where she had first thrown his tea service in frustrated rebellion, watching Jean Wu conduct the final briefing that would close the chapter on the Bratva's territorial ambitions. His voice carried the controlled authority she had learned to associate with decisive action. But she could see the way his attention divided between professional responsibilities and her presence in ways that would have been impossible before shared combat had rewired his priorities. The men responsible for the attack had been located and dealt with according to the harsh mathematics that govern conflicts between criminal organizations. The survivors had received clear communication about the costs of future interference with Jean Wu's operations or personnel. The territorial dispute that had begun with an assassination attempt in an elegant restaurant had been concluded through methods that ensured it would not require revisiting. When the last of his security chiefs had filed out of the office, Jean Wu turned to face her with an expression she had never seen before. Not the controlled mask of professional distance, not the careful courtesy of protection duty, but something approaching vulnerability that made her chest tight with recognition of how completely their dynamic had shifted. "It is finished," he said simply, though the weight those words carried extended far beyond tactical outcomes and organizational security. Arya nodded, understanding that he was referring to more than just external threats. The arrangement that had brought her to his compound, the protective custody that had kept her safe while Russian assassins hunted for loose ends to eliminate, the circumstances that had forced them together against both their intentions. All of that was complete now, resolved through violence that had proven Jean Wu's devotion while revealing capabilities that had earned his absolute respect. "You are free to leave," he continued, his tone carrying careful neutrality that could not quite conceal the cost such freedom would exact from him. "No further threats exist to your safety. No obligations bind you to remain here or maintain any connection to my organization. Your life can return to whatever configuration you choose to create." The offer was genuine, delivered with the same sincerity he brought to all significant communications. But Arya could see the way his hands remained perfectly still on his desk, could read the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man preparing himself for loss that would hollow out everything he had discovered about happiness in the past month. She had spent the morning considering her options with the same systematic analysis she brought to all major decisions. Nursing school could be resumed, though explaining her absence would require creative interpretation of recent events. Her grandmother's medical needs could be addressed through conventional means now that Jean Wu's resources were no longer necessary for financial security. The ordinary life she had been building before 5 Russians changed everything could theoretically be recovered and continued. But that life belonged to someone else now, to a woman who had not discovered that protection could evolve into partnership, that strength could be amplified rather than diminished by genuine connection, that love could grow in the most dangerous circumstances and flourish because of shared understanding rather than despite conflicting worlds. "What are you offering me if I stay?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Everything," Jean Wu replied without hesitation. "My protection, which you have already proven you do not require, but which I would provide anyway. My resources, which could support whatever ambitions you choose to pursue. My organization, which could use someone with your medical expertise and tactical capabilities. My respect, which you have earned through competence and courage. My love, which you possess completely whether you choose to accept it or not." The declaration was comprehensive and honest, laying out exactly what partnership with him would mean without minimizing its complexities or potential dangers. He was not offering her safety in exchange for dependency. He was offering her everything he had in recognition of everything she was, partnership between equals who had tested each other under the most demanding circumstances and found the combination stronger than either could achieve independently. "And what would you expect in return?" she asked, though his expression had already begun providing the answer. "Nothing," he said, the word carrying absolute finality. "Your presence if you choose to give it. Your partnership if you find value in what we could build together. Your love if it continues to grow as mine has grown. But I expect nothing, require nothing, demand nothing. You have given me more than I deserved simply by surviving what my world brought to your doorstep." The honesty of it took her breath away. Recognition that he was offering her genuine choice rather than sophisticated manipulation. She could leave, and he would let her go, would ensure her safety and independence without bitterness or recrimination. Or she could stay and become his equal partner in a life that would never be ordinary, but would never be boring either. The decision, when it came, felt less like choice and more like recognition of truth that had been obvious for weeks, but which circumstances had prevented her from acknowledging. Jinwoo Park had become her home in ways that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the recognition of someone whose strengths complemented her own perfectly. "I am not going anywhere," she said, watching relief transform his controlled expression into something approaching joy. "But I have conditions." His smile was genuine for the first time since she had known him, carrying warmth that made her understand why lesser men stepped aside when he entered rooms. "Name them. I want to finish my nursing degree, possibly continue into advanced medical training that would be useful to your organization. I want to maintain contact with my family without endangering them through association with your business activities. I want to be truly useful here, not decorative or symbolic, but contributing real value through my skills and experience. And I want to know that what we build together is based on choice rather than circumstance, partnership rather than protection. All of that can be arranged," he said, rising from his desk to close the distance between them. "But I have one condition of my own." She raised an eyebrow in question, amused by his presumption, but curious about what he might consider necessary. "Marry me," he said simply, the words carrying none of the elaborate ceremony such proposals usually required. Not because circumstances demand it or because convention expects it, but because I want the world to know that you chose to bind your life to mine from a position of freedom rather than necessity. The proposal was perfectly Jinwoo, direct and honest, and focused on the essential rather than the decorative. No elaborate staging or emotional manipulation, just recognition that what had grown between them deserved formal acknowledgement and legal protection. She found herself thinking about her grandmother's marriage, the way love had sustained two people through decades of hardship and uncertainty, about partnerships that were built on mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy, that grew stronger through shared challenges rather than weaker, about the way Jinwoo had proven his devotion through action rather than words, had offered her everything while expecting nothing in return. "Yes," she said, the word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He kissed her then with the controlled passion that characterized everything else about him, careful and thorough and completely focused on a response. It felt like claiming and surrender simultaneously, recognition that they had chosen each other from positions of strength rather than weakness. Later, much later, they stood together on the balcony outside his private quarters, looking out at gardens that had been restored to their previous beauty but would never again represent simply aesthetic pleasure. Now, they were part of a defensive system, carefully designed to provide both beauty and tactical advantage, luxury that acknowledged rather than ignored the realities of the world they inhabited together. "I need to ask you something," Arias said, turning in his arms to study his face. "What we have been through together, this whole dangerous beginning to our relationship, do you ever worry that normal life might feel boring by comparison? Do you think what we feel for each other can survive ordinary happiness?" Jinwoo considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to all serious matters, his hand tracing the line of her jaw with gentle precision. "I think what we have built together is strong enough to survive anything. Combat and quiet evenings at home, external threats and domestic disagreements, the adrenaline of shared danger and the deeper satisfaction of shared peace. We have tested each other under impossible circumstances and found that we work better together than apart. That is not something that disappears when life becomes less dramatic." His certainty was infectious, supported by evidence rather than wishful thinking. They had indeed tested each other under conditions that stripped away pretense and revealed essential character. What they had discovered was compatibility that extended far beyond crisis situations to include intellectual respect, complementary capabilities, and the kind of rare attraction that deepened rather than faded with knowledge. The compound settled into its evening rhythms around them, security teams maintaining their vigilance while domestic staff prepared for another peaceful night. It was the kind of routine that would have been impossible during the weeks when Russian assassins posed active threats, but which had been earned through violence that had proven how far Jinwoo would go to protect what belonged to him. Arya belonged to him now by choice rather than circumstance, partnership freely chosen rather than protection grudgingly accepted. The cage had become sanctuary not through Stockholm Syndrome or emotional manipulation, but through recognition that sometimes the most dangerous man in the world could offer the safest possible future for a woman strong enough to stand beside him rather than behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges requiring their combined attention and capabilities. Jinwoo's organization would continue to expand, requiring medical expertise that Arya could provide while building toward the advanced degree that would make her even more valuable. They would navigate the complex integration of her family into a life that required discretion about certain professional activities while providing resources that could transform their security and prosperity. But tonight was theirs, stolen from a world that demanded constant vigilance, and shared with someone who had proven worthy of the complete trust that military combat and romantic love both required. Tonight, they could be simply themselves rather than tactical assets or organizational leaders or any of the other roles their circumstances demanded. Tonight, they could enjoy the particular satisfaction that came from surviving impossible circumstances together and choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy them. The future stretched ahead of them like uncharted territory filled with possibilities rather than threats. Adventures they would share rather than dangers they would face separately. It was not the ordinary life either of them had originally planned, but it was theirs, chosen freely and defended fiercely and worth every difficult moment that had brought them to this place of hard-earned peace. Together, they had become something stronger and more complete than either could have achieved alone. Together, they would face whatever came next with the confidence that comes from testing love under fire and finding it both genuine and indestructible. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.